Very pleased to bring onto the stage Denise Kelly with Saventure, who's going to talk to us a little bit about investment, right? How are you investing in the microbiome? How is this industry growing, and what are the emerging opportunities? So Denise, if you want to turn your camera on, and then we'll allow you to share your screen. See you there. Welcome, Denise.
Well, thank you very much. So I just want to make sure you can see my screen okay?
Yep, I sure can. If you just want to go into presentation mode, and I'm going to turn the stage over to you. Looks great.
Super, and you can see it clearly. Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, so firstly, I just want to thank Len, Nathan, Tracy, and Zoe for their very kind invitation to present today. So I'm actually presenting on behalf of Saventure. We obviously have been one of the leading investors in the microbiome space. So today I'm going to talk about the growth of the industry and what I see as some of the emerging opportunities. So my presentation, I want to look at about a decade of research. We've just heard the description of the microbiome field as pretty early, but I think we've come a very long way. I wanted to look at some of the latest scientific and investment trends, also highlight what I think are some of the very hot areas, emerging areas, and then I'd like to sum up by really trying to sort of summarize what investors are actually looking for, because I know there's many, many of you out there that are either advancing on a therapeutic front or on a food supplement probiotic front that are really looking for investment. So to start, I'm using a slide which I got from courtesy of Rob Knight from UCSD. And it really tells you how this industry began. So 10 years ago, we virtually knew nothing of the microbes that were in the gut. We knew mostly what pathogens were there, but we knew very little about commensal microbes. And about 2005, we started to see the first papers emerge of describing at very sort of high level, phyla, genus, what's in the human gut. And you can see just in this little area of California, 10 years went from 202 samples to literally thousands and thousands of samples and huge mass of gene sequence data from the microbiome. And if you think about today, I mean, today we're talking about the need for massive machines, learnings, cloud-based systems to handle the data that's been amassed on a global scale around the microbiome. So if we think about what we actually do know, on this slide, I know everyone will have seen this many, many times. Microbes maketh man, as we've just heard in the last speaker, our other genome. And we know that we're predominantly microbial, and a small percentage of our genome is actually human. And we know that this microbiome includes the skin, the gut, the lung, the urogenital, vaginal, and even now we talk about tumor-specific microbiomes. And I think the other area that it's really brought to the forefront is the idea that from the gut, where a lot of these products are targeting, that we have the gut-brain connection. We now know we have the gut-lung connection, gut-liver and gut-skin axis. So the research that has happened over the last 10 years has brought incredible insight onto areas that are really impacting our microbiomes, but also importantly, our biology and our physiology. So I thought I would just start with a comment on microbiome samples and robust analytics. And I think this 10 years has essentially helped us really understand how do we get really genuine, authentic data. And we now see huge papers coming from the likes of Rob Knight and others showing the importance of establishing really robust workflows. So we have to have very clear reference genomes. We need to be careful from everything from sample collection right through to the analytics. And there's now very clear guidelines on how we report studies, human studies, so that you can compare one study to another, as mentioned in the previous talks. The other area that I think is really important is this area of confounders, the very question we had. Absolutely crucial that we understand the variables, both at the host level, but also from coming from drugs, for example, PPIs, the type of drugs that people are subjected to every day have major impact on the composition of the microbiome, but also the activity of the microbiome and the efficacy of some of the key drugs that we're using to treat disease. And I think then the other sort of learning, and something that's really vital, is that to make sense of the data, we have to operate at scale. So small cohorts are fine, but really to really get the insight we need, we really need to be working on large scale studies. And the other area which is really important is the precision at which we can interpret the sequence data. And I think if, you know, that to me is the holy grail, the quality, quantity and precision at which we can resolve metagenome microbiome data. So to support all of these efforts in sequencing, we had many, both public and private initiatives. And the story really began in two parts of the world, I guess, in the US with the Human Microbiome Project, and I'm proud to say also in Europe with MetaHit. And you've seen from then an expansion of huge numbers of initiatives to really globally amass our insight into the human microbiome. And we're supported by organizations like PRI, who now really have bought into this field and understand that this goes beyond science, that we really are in a major paradigm shift where we can use microbiome research to translate to human health and wellness and to treat disease. So if we think of what we do know now, and this is very top headline, any one of these topics, you could spend an entire conference, but we know that microbial ecology shifts throughout life stages. So for example, we know in early life that there's major impact of birth mode, breastfeeding. As we're growing through adolescent period, nutrition, the type of diet that we take, what type of supplements, what type of functional foods really impact the microbiome. We know that the drugs we're subjected to are impacting, and equally whether we live in an urban or a rural lifestyle has a major impact. And if you take some very recent work, which is examining all phases of life, you can see the 10-year first years of life, major research showing that altered microbiota are a failure of the gut microbiota to develop in the very systematic, precise succession method that we know occurs, can result in atopic diseases such as asthma and other food allergy type diseases. And this work is led by Susan Lynch and other teams that are really working to understand that early life microbiome. And equally at the other end of life, we now see focused efforts on centenarians, where we're looking at the microbiota of centenarians. And to go for the headline and maybe the hype comment, you have then papers by the likes of John Cryan, who are actually looking at the centenarian data and asking the question, is the microbiome the fountain of youth? And well, time will tell. So why are we focused on the microbiome? Well, I think what we've learned is that antibiotics and sanitation, and I call this the germophobic years, where we just use vast quantities of antibiotics. And we use these, which were very broad acting, broad spectrum. And we really have done a lot to impact our own microbiome, but also the environment around us. And this brings me to the very nice link that comes from the famous book from Martin Blaser, referring to the missing microbes. In other words, our lifestyle, we have removed many of the important organisms that are really key to maintaining health. And what is the evidence that this has happened? Well, again, you can look at these results and you can see virtually every report of every chronic human disease. If we look at what's happening incidence to right up to 2020, there is a exponential increase in autoimmune diseases, and it impacts all ends of the T cell spectrum. So for example, Th1, Th17, Th2, and we know that we have major issues around autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes. We also have inflammatory diseases like Crohn's and allergic diseases like asthma, all on the increase. So what is the reason to believe that microbiome diversity composition in IBD could be relevant either as causal or actually could be used to inform on a curative product? And the types of data, I've just selected a few. I think some of the best evidence is coming from studies which are used in fecal microbiota transplantation. And we can see at least 3 studies here where they're showing that FMT can induce remission in patients with ulcerative colitis. And these are healthy donor microbiome transplantations. And again, you can see multiple publications reinforcing this observation. In addition to inflammatory diseases, if we now look at the other growth area, which is in cancer, you will all be familiar with the study from Eric Paymer's work, where they've shown that patients undergoing hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, that diversity really impacts overall survival. So high diversity, better survival. And then we have studies now coming more recently, which are showing that bacterial composition is actually a factor contributing to resistance of a patient to checkpoint inhibitor blockade. And we've also used FMT, and there are more studies than the one that's conducted by Jen Vargo, but they've shown that FMT from either responders or from healthy donors can actually potentiate checkpoint blockade in the treatment of cancer. And finally, I just wanted to put this in because obviously each of these examples I've given point to therapeutic exploitation of microbiome. Here, what we start to see is not only the microbes in our body and our gut are impacting drug efficacy, we can also use foods. So for example, here, fermented foods can have major impact on the human microbiome and influence our immune status and healthy immune function or predisposition to immune-mediated diseases. And you can see again growth in the interest in fermented foods, but also in the seeking novel foods, novel functional foods that can use bugs are used in fermentation of plant-based proteins. So we have this image of massing data showing that microbiome within our cells and from our foods can impact health. So this work is obviously very exciting. It's mainly science driven, science which is peer reviewed, extensively peer reviewed, and has actually come together to provide the evidence that we have now of the importance of the microbiome. And you can see that there is no slowing of efforts, research and publication efforts demonstrating the effect of microbiome in many aspects of biology. But the most important point I want to highlight and pick up here is the patent landscape. And this is work that we've done ourselves within Saventure. We've shown that in 2020, there were an estimate of 2,500 patents relevant to the microbiome, 800 of which were granted in 2020. The total patent portfolio since the last 10 years is of the order of 14,000 patents, 800 granted. Now, patents and science. What is it for us? Well, translation of microbiome science is why we're all here. And we can see that it's important in human health and wellness and obviously has clear therapeutic potential. And it goes back to these tiny organisms with big impact. And I can absolutely say I was one of the pioneers of this thinking. I went into the first commensal microbes to look at the impact in terms of immunity. So tiny organisms impacting human health is the message. And in this 10 years, what I've seen now is we've got 2,500 plus clinical trials. So what's the good news? This isn't just ongoing. These are ongoing clinical trials with readout, phase 3 clinical readout, IND, FDA regulated. And what we now know is we have a number of companies that are now showing, so for example, Ceres Therapeutics, first microbiome-based drug clears phase 3, Ferring Rebiotics, equally landmark phase 3, and Vedanta, interestingly, are one of the first company, in fact, to advance a very defined consortium of bugs for the treatment of recurrent C. difficile. And it moves beyond the treatment of infectious C. difficile. We now had readout from a phase 2 clinical trial by Evelo, who are using an inactivated bug administered orally to treat skin psoriasis. And then finally, I just wanted to point, because obviously these are very therapeutic approaches, but in the same context, we have a lot of buzz around Pendulum Life on their probiotic Akkermansia for regulating blood glucose with clinical supported data. So what does the microbiome market look like? And I want to take this in segments. So because of the nature of the conference, I want to talk a little bit about probiotics and food supplements, and then I'll obviously move to therapeutics. And so currently, in terms of market, the biggest probiotics dominate that market for sure. And what we've seen from Len, which was a super talk, is that the consumer and the field interest in prebiotics and postbiotics is following hot on the probiotic tail. So I think we have a lot of reason to be optimism that there will be great progress in the coming years in this field. I've highlighted some of the consumer opportunities. Now, these are companies that some of you may know, others may not, but you can see a lot of biotechs working, for example, in early life, and I've highlighted companies like Evolve, Genevine. I think I've got Astarte on here and others that are working in the early life. Metabolic health is obviously a key area of interest. So we've got Amancia in our own portfolio, Targeteds in our portfolio. We have Pendulum, as I just mentioned, and Keel's Health, all working around the use of new generation, I would call them new generation, next generation probiotics, even prebiotics and also postbiotics to advance metabolic health. And then a comment maybe on bone health, where there's perhaps less interest, but certainly an emerging field where Celeria Bio are obviously pushing the area, big interest in other areas like skin and women's health. So if we look at investment, so I often hear the complaint that there hasn't been a lot of investment in particularly consumer products, but actually this is work I've done using PitchBook, but it's highly curated. So I've uploaded 123 microbiome companies that are really engaged in the consumer space. And what you can see is level of VC funding is really starting to increase, big surge in 2021. I have some views on why I think that's happened, and I'm happy to comment on it. And you can also see that's a very active area now, particularly 2020, which is, I think, seeing trends where there's more corporate strategic M&A. These investment deals equated to about 350 deals over 123 companies. So I think indicating again, everything's on the up. So I think we can be quite optimistic that this area is going to grow and grow year on year. And then I want to talk to the supplements. So supplements are obviously coming in lowest, the category 370 million. And again, you can see a growing trend in VC interest. We also see a lot of private equity going in, and clearly also an IPO as well, which was really nice to see in this particular space. The number of investments that we're done here, obviously, again, for 142 companies, you're talking about 246 investment deals. And you can see, again, just the break of where the source of the money is coming from, and the deal source is predominantly VC. So an area which I spend a lot of time in is a therapeutic opportunity, and I think it's quite important to cover this within the talk. So clearly we've heard from several speakers and the meeting that, you know, we know the product ranges are very diverse. So we've got diverse modalities from FMT right through to defined consortia, single strain products, engineered GMOs, molecules from bugs, and also obviously phage therapy. These are all regulated by FDA. The FMT field looks really interesting, and there's a lot of focus on it. And the consortia single strain in the therapeutic space, huge competition. And also clearly we know that there are regulatory hurdles, but this is always highlighted as a particular challenge. But our experience from working with a lot of the biotechs that are facing the FDA, they're in phase 1, 2, 3. FDA has been incredibly supportive, and I think EMA also are catching ground. We believe, and we have been told often, that pharma are far more comfortable around molecules rather than bugs. But actually, I think when I present this slide on level of pharma activity, you'll see that pharma are actually extremely excited about the microbiome and therapeutic opportunity. And it brings in this issue of one size fits all. I think microbiome has really fueled the notion of precision medicine, that we can start to find microbiome signatures as diagnostics and an important way for patient stratification, which I think is going to prove to be really important in successful clinical outcome. So up to now, I think infectious disease has dominated the field, closely followed by the interest in GI, so particularly inflammatory bowel disease. But now I think the field is wide open. We're seeing much more interest in oncology, given the recent publications showing the importance of the microbiome in terms of IO outcome, for example. And also we see a great interest in CNS, neurodevelopmental, neurodegenerative diseases. And interestingly, I just wanted to highlight this because it's definitely something that's come under my new register, which is an increased interest in the oral microbiome, even to the point that we've seen some of the first conferences organized by Kasako and Hanson Wade on the oral microbiome. So these are some of the companies. Most of them you will be familiar with, like the Vedanta, Mat Pharma, Enterum. They're all within Saventure portfolio. Some newcomers which are worth looking at: Federation Bio, which is, I would say, somewhere between an FMT and defined consortia. We've got companies that are worth looking at, like Athos, that are new, and a new company, Ancilia. In addition to these companies that are advancing either FMT or defined consortia, we have very significant interest in virome, but using the gut virome viruses as therapeutics. And for example, I want to highlight one of our recent investments in Abelos from Saventure, and another company that we've been looking at, Toles, and also Ion Bio within our portfolio, but definitely something to look at and consider, that the field of microbiome is diversifying outside just focus on bacteria, but now looking at the virome. And clearly then major activity within the CRISPR phage of specific editing and eliminating causal pathobionts. So in terms of investment, clearly, I think this is astonishing, but over 10 years or so, the total capital invested, predominantly VC, is 8.61 billion. This is based on 308 microbiome companies, which I've downloaded and curated. It includes some of the CROs and some of the CDMOs. And again, you can see that it's been incredibly active. We've had some strategic M&As, which I'll touch on, and some important liquidity IPOs. The number of deals over these 308 is greater than 1,000, so highly active area of investment. And you can see that the trends are growing even with COVID. So I think this slide to me is one of the most important. It covers both activities through the COVID year at a pharma level, but also food. And I want to start with pharma. So pharma are really engaged in the microbiome. So you have the big GSK deal with Eligo, Pfizer working with Vedanta, Ferring Rebiotics acquisition, as we knew about. We have companies like, I want to go up to the top, Kaleido just announced a further extension of its collaboration with Janssen, and Sanofi have just acquired Oregon. On the IPO side, really busy year. So we had Fitch on NASDAQ, we have Caribou on NASDAQ, and one close to home, Mat Pharma. Our company have just launched the first successful IPO on Euronext. And in the consumer side, I want to point out that BioGaia continues to really interface gut and skin. We have Rebiotics extending their interest in women's health. We see that ADM have acquired Deerland Probiotics and so on. So I would say for a year of COVID, where industry and investment and IPOs have been really dynamic and showing that the field is starting to really progress in a very significant way. There's always something that we have to register, and I think this actually should have been aligned with Sarah's. Actually, Sarah's, as you all know, had a product 287 for ulcerative colitis, and you know that it has been withdrawn for further analysis because it didn't meet the primary endpoint in ulcerative colitis, which in my mind is a responsible thing to do, and based on Serum 109, they'll be back strong. The other thing that maybe we need to become more mindful of, and I think this covers both sectors, whether you're in food or supplements or probiotics or even therapeutics, that the patent landscape is very competitive and there's a lot of stuff under the radar. And I want to highlight these two recent announcements where Finch are being sued by Ferring over the FMT products, and equally Eligo have just won a successful opposition proceedings against Microbiome, which has led to cancellation of Snipper's IP. So I think the field in that regard, and from an investor perspective, something we have to be really very vigilant on. So what I think are the emerging growing areas? Well, for me, there's a huge amount happening both on the consumer and the patient front. I think we're going to see more and more novel microbial interventions across many diseases. And this is as we source what I call more robust microbes. It's a little bit cryptic, but that's what we're seeing in the field. There's a huge focus on the FMT field for reasons of really understanding the efficacy in more chronic diseases other than C. diff, and also clearly how the LBP space is going to perform, because that is going to be a really important milestone for the field. There's greater precision and accuracy, and I think this is around the machine learning AI approach, which becomes so big data sets are the way forward, I'm convinced. And then what I'm really loving is this ability to integrate data sets to identify new targets and mechanisms of action. So we're going to move beyond short chain fatty acids and Tregs, for example. I want to really give a shout out from Saventure as well. We see this as a really hot area. So the whole area of prebiotic, postbiotics, functional foods, nutritional, we really are keen to see as many opportunities there. And so, you know, bring them on, as we think this is an important area. Innovation is, I think, really across all stages. We're seeing it from early life to aging. As I mentioned at the beginning, ecology, functionality, including omics, so metabolome, not just description of who's there. We're seeing greater diversification and focus, as I mentioned, bacteria, viruses, and fungi. And I really do think that with the AI machine learning approach, we're going to get more insight from reverse engineering, so exploiting human data, and without doubt, synthetic biology engineered bacteria delivering novel host mechanisms and payloads is something we see a huge increase in deal flow. So just on the deal flow, I want to give a comment on Saventure. We are actively investing. The fund that is actually active at this is called Health for Life 2 Capital. It's the second big fund that we have closed for total focus in microbiome investments. It is the capital of the fund has increased from Health for Life Capital 1 to 250 million. And in 2022, we are really continuing to ramp up our investments. We've extended from early stage to late stage, and we will say we have an average, for anyone who wants to know, our average investment ticket is 5 million, up to 20, but it's on a company by company basis, so it can extend on either sides of that. In terms of how do you get investment, I often get asked this, and I would have to say the bar is obviously very high given the level of competition. And I think the key message is you have to demonstrate differentiation now, particularly now, and that means you need to understand the competition. And more important than that, you have to speak to the strength of your product and the uniqueness of your product. You have to know the full ownership, the whole proof of concept. You've had to consider how you're going to get to markets. That means considering CMC, considering your regulatory path, and then also the clinical validation, be it a food or be it a therapeutic. The clinical path seems to be open to both. Really importantly, as I've highlighted for reasons that everyone will understand, freedom to operate, patentability is key here. And most important, you've got to consider what your route to exit is. Is this going to be an acquired asset? What's the appetite for this in the field? And these are all key considerations when you bring your pitch to Saventure. So I think at that point, I just want to say thank you very much and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Denise, thank you so much. Sorry, had a little camera issue there. Thank you so much. We are unfortunately out of time for today's session, but we do see a number of questions that came in. And what I'd love to do is hopefully we can schedule a time to do a follow-up Q&A, and we'll make sure to get all these excellent questions over to Denise to get you guys answers, because she is such a tremendous expert for this space. And we thank you for spending your time with us today.
Thank you very much.